My name is Vanessa McPhail, and I'm with Diversity, Equity, and Poverty. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you all for coming out tonight. On behalf of Diversity, Equity, and Poverty, under Dr. John Marshall, we present these speaker series to you. And you are in for a very exciting treat with Dr. Mathies. She is currently the Goal Clarity Coach at Shawnee Academy, and she did her doctoral work at U of L. And she's going to talk to you about her study, and then she's going to talk to you about color grade and many more things. And I just want to say thank you and welcome. And bathrooms are out this door to your left, and make sure you signed in. And then those of you who are in the AP principal cohort, please know I will make sure to get that sign-in list to Margie Eckerly. And then Mr. Abdul Sharif is over here for those of you who'd like to give your aha or your testimony or just give nuggets of what you learned in the PD. We would love to have, or the community conversation, we would love to have that. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. LaRhonda Mathies.
So before I get started, so you don't have to move again, I have a few people who probably want to join a bigger group. So if y'all want to join some bigger groups before we get started, because you're going to be talking. We're going to have a conversation with the people in your group. So let's give you a little time to move for a second.
I know you see me.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so I want to thank Vanessa and the Diversity, Equity, and Poverty Department for inviting me here. As she said, I'm Dr. LaRhonda Mathies. I'm the academic instructional coach at the Academy Shawnee. And what I do basically, what I tell students is I teach teachers, if you didn't know that. So that's pretty much my job. And also I work with students, and some of my students are here. We're going to introduce them in a minute. I wanted to get started to talk about the theme that I was given, excellent, engaged, and excited. So I received this invitation a year ago. So after thinking about what this means to be excellent, engaged, and excited as a girl of color, I thought about my own experiences growing up in Louisville. I'm a Louisville native. I grew up in Smoketown and the West End. So I'm very familiar with JCPS in Louisville. And growing up here, my experiences in my childhood as a girl, I went to the Brown School. Anybody familiar with the Brown School? Yeah, so when I say the Brown School, you know that I was one of the few people of color at the Brown School. So let me put that out there. And being one of the few people of color at the Brown School in my childhood, I was always seen as different, right? So I was the smart kid. But being the smart kid came with some baggage, being the only person of color in my classes. So thinking about being excellent, engaged, and excited, and growing up as a kid and going to the Brown School, I want to share a childhood memory of that experience, if that's okay with you all, okay? So growing up, being the only one, when you're in elementary school, you have sleepovers as a girl, right? So that was common for me. Having sleepovers with, and it was mainly white girls, maybe one or two, but I would usually go over their house. I think on one occasion they may have come to my house growing up. And so in my experiences, I just never thought about being the brown girl amongst mainly white girls in elementary school. And so in that experience, race never really entered my mind as a kid in elementary school. Until I had a moment as a brown girl in the 5th grade. I was at a sleepover as the only brown girl. And so business as usual, eating Doritos, eating M&M's, staying up, toilet paper to trees, kid stuff, right? And then I remember we traveled, because I grew up on 42nd, in River Park, we traveled a long distance. So I'm recalling somewhere out like Prospect. So imagine me, little girl from West End, going all the way out to Prospect somewhere. And of course I'm like, wow, look at these mansions. That's all I remember. I have no idea what that house looked like, but I remember I called mansion. So, wealthy, privileged family is where I stayed in this home. And so, it was time to get up the next morning, and the mother gave us all parting gifts. We got these hats as parting gifts for sleeping over, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. My fresh, free hat from my rich friend that lived in a mansion. I could do no wrong, right? Until my parents saw what was on this hat. So, if you can imagine, in my little 5th grade self, with my hat on, coming home from this sleepover in Prospect.
Come on. I can't wait.
Yes.
Oh.
No, thank you.
Wow, that's the maggot.
Say it ain't so.
That's the maggot today.
Yes. True story. My mama's here, mama. True story. Okay. So, I recall walking in with this hat and the look that my parents gave me. Like, have you lost your mind? 5th grade, I'm a kid. I don't know what this means. But I eventually, soon enough, found out what that meant. And so I'm talking to you about this story to give you a narrative of being a kid growing up and being exposed to race for the first time. It was like my first encounter of realizing what being black meant when my parents explained about this hat and the history of this hat and what it meant to my family. And so I do recall my mother specifically giving me conversations about race, about slavery, about her experiences with Jim Crow growing up. My mother and father had to drink from colored-only water fountains. We're not talking about my great-grandparents.
Right.
My mama and my daddy.
That's right.
Okay? So, you know, as a kid, my mind started to shift and think differently about the world once I received these stories about what it means to be black in America, based upon the history of this hat. And so, being a young black girl, I want you all to think about the young black girls in our communities and what it means to be a girl of color in our community and their encounters with race that most adults probably wouldn't even think about. When we're talking about ensuring that girls are excelling, engaged, and excited, I also want to talk about how do we not just get them excited and excelling, but how do we empower them? So my message today is going to be about empowerment. Empowering our girls of color. Making sure that they feel proud of who they are and where they come from. In education, we hear a lot of times about the power of yet. Anybody ever heard the power of yet? Right? Not yet. When we're talking about our kids, they don't have it yet. But when I was growing up, and the way my parents instilled empowerment, it was about the power of and. You're poor, you're black, you're a girl, and you're smart. You're poor, you're black, you're a girl, and you're artistic. You're poor, you're black, you're a girl, and you are a leader. So when we're talking about empowering our girls, what message do we send with the power of and? You may be one thing as far as how the world sees you, but you are other things that we're going to bring out of you. The power of and. And so my power of and involved my parents instilling the pride of my African ancestry. And so an example of that would be, I always remember my mother wearing Afrocentric clothing and wearing Adinkra symbols. Anybody know what Adinkra symbol is? Okay? Wearing Adinkra symbols on her clothing. And I remember these memories of being proud of being a black person because of the Afrocentric culture and education that was instilled in my household. So all you are. So empowering our girls of color, especially when we're talking about our black girls, because we are in a state of emergency, if you did not realize that. For those of us that work in the school system, you know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to our girls. And so when we empower them to be prideful about where they come from, it creates a sense of consciousness that makes them think differently about themselves. And so I wanted to present to you images, especially the Sankofa bird. Anybody heard of the Sankofa bird? Who knows what it means? What's the purpose? What does it symbolize?
Look back, to look forward.
Look forward. So it's about remembering our past, right? And so these messages of remembering our past to move forward. And that, as I recall as a kid, when my first encounters with race, is what gave me power within myself as a young black girl. Another thing I want you to think about when we're talking about empowering our girls, especially our girls of color in schools, is how do we love other people's children? Because in schools, in classrooms, I see a lot of adults struggle with our girls because they don't understand how to love girls of color. And so when we're loving other people's children, there's a book by Lisa Delpit. And Lisa Delpit talks about the silenced dialogue that occurs with other people's children. Especially when we're talking about classrooms and schools and public education, things occur when people don't speak up. And for you all, when I'm talking about loving girls of color, we have to be brave enough to speak up and not be silent when we see things happening. In Delpit's work, she talks about in order for all children to succeed, you can't just worry about your own. Let me say it one more time. In order for all children to succeed, we can't just worry about our own kids. Especially as educators, if you are an educator in the room. And loving other people's children means you treat other people's children like they're your own children. And I know that that is something that is very common in my family, in my community. I recall many aunties and uncles in academic areas. We call this fictive kinships. You're not biologically my grandmother or my uncle or my grandfather, but for some reason my parents told me you were. So, according to them, we are family. And so as educators and community members, we need to think about our kids as family and how we love other people's children, especially our girls of color. But that can be uncomfortable. Especially if you don't know how, or if you've never been forced to love someone else's child. And so another part of our message is, cliche as it is we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable in order to love other people's children so they can be successful. So in this conversation, and in my story, and the rest of this evening, a lot of what we'll talk about is race. And race can be uncomfortable, especially if you're not used to talking about it. Singleton has a book called Courageous Conversations, and this is what I follow when we're talking about collective commitments, when we're having conversations about race. The main thing I want you to remember is be open. This is a non-judgmental space. Speak your truth in our conversations because I believe that we are all here for the good of kids at the end of the day. And that's what I want to keep at the forefront. This is self-reflective. There's no tips and tricks. I'm not going to give you no silver bullets on how to fix girls of color. That's not what I do. But what I do like to do is facilitate conversations so people can be open about where they are and where they want to go when it comes to supporting our kids in JCPS. There will be a lot of visuals. It will be interactive. Again, you'll have a chance to talk to people in your circle about your own experiences. You don't have to talk, but I will invite you to please share, to talk and discuss what you perceive are your perceptions of how to support girls of color and your experiences growing up as a child yourself. So, with that being said, I'm going to invite you to talk to the people in your circle. You're going to think about, right now, what lessons, beliefs, or values were you taught about race and gender. It could be lessons from home, lessons from school, or lessons from your community. Or maybe it's a story, like I shared with you. Maybe it's your first early experience working or interacting with race. Everybody get where we're going? Everybody got a thought in their head? Okay, let's turn around and give you some time to share and talk.
We were doing the right thing, and if we weren't, they'll snatch us in a minute. And I remember as a child, by me being the youngest, everybody was always watching over me because they wanted to make sure that I didn't get in trouble. But sometimes my mother worked 2 shifts, so sometimes I didn't have. I was a latchkey child, so I'm at home, but it was no problem because I loved to study. Didn't have to ask me to study because I thought I was a little whippersnapper. So I loved school and I loved education, but it was a village. That's what I recall.
I don't know, with me, we originally grew up in the Portland area. And at that time, there were very few blacks in the Portland area. So in the first grade, I had my first experience of racism because a play was being done. They wanted some of the girls to dance, to do ballet. And they didn't think that I knew how to do ballet. But my mother had taken the expense of making sure I learned ballet and tap and everything. And so it ended up, I had to dance with one of the white guys in the first grade. I remember his name to this day. His name was Roy, and he had blue eyes. So I had to dance with him. And it was just so known that, and you could hear the people in the audience, no. And so, but after that, I was fine. And then we went to Smoketown, and we went to Jackson.
So when we're talking about things that happen in school, especially with girls of color, in JCPS, we're finding data that's telling us that black girls specifically do not feel a sense of belonging. For whatever reason, whatever they're bringing from home is not being nurtured, it's not being valued, it's not being seen, whatever's happening. So I would ask that you let me just focus in on not only girls of color, but within that, black girls. Because when we look at our data, that is who is missing out on the educational experience. And when we're looking at black girls in discipline and suspension, they're the ones that have the high disproportionality in JCPS. So in my doctoral research, that's where my passion and my heart lies, for marginalized voices. And in this case, that voice would be black girls. So let's look at some examples. Because I mentioned JCPS, but this isn't a JCPS thing. This is across America. So when we look at these beautiful brown faces, we see that these black girls have been stigmatized. So when we're talking about Celicia, our little baby, 6-year-old, handcuffed for having a temper tantrum, the Scott twins, discipline for wearing braids in their hair. When we look at Kayla was disciplined for her afro and kicked out of school. When we're looking at this unknown student in the corner, that is actually a recent, in January, this child was in a fight. She's 15. You see men, those are men, grabbing her by her hair, banging her head on the table, and they were kicking her in the leg to break up a fight. Shakara, 16. Does anybody recall what happened with Shakara? What happened to Shakara? Picked up, slammed her. Anybody remember why? She wouldn't get out of her seat. Grown men picking up teenage black girls and treating them like animals, for lack of a better term. And then we have Naya. Does anybody know what Naya did? Because she was there too, with Shakara. Naya recorded what happened on her phone. And you know what happened to Naya? She got drug up out of there too. And handcuffed. And arrested. And she eventually left the school. She finished her GED somewhere else. But because Naya wouldn't stop recording, they locked her up too. So when we're talking about what's happening with our girls of color, specifically our black girls are being criminalized for being black and a girl. So we're talking about how do we address this? What do we do? Because we see that this injustice is not uncommon. There's countless, these are just a few that I found, but there are countless news articles about girls of color being manhandled because of discipline issues. So there was a report that came out, Black Girls Matter, and in this report, it describes what I just talked about. So in Black Girls Matter, they discuss how black girls are not protected in public education. In Black Girls Matter, they talk about the research that reflects how black girls experience punitive policies at disproportionate rates compared to white girls. And in this report, they discuss how there is a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, there is a lack of understanding why black girls are not acting the way girls should act. So this research is revealing that there is some mismatch, miscommunication, misunderstanding about what it means to be feminine. And according to this research, black girls are not feminine enough for adults in schools. So they are perceived differently. So, feminine. I'm not feminine if I talk like this. I'm not feminine if I say, hey girl. I'm not feminine if I am who I am and where I come from in my community. That is punished. So again, we want to go back to whatever our girls are bringing into the classroom, it is not valued. It is not seen. It is not considered the right way to be in our classrooms. So another part of this report, I just want to give you a visual. Now, mind you, this report and the research was done in New York and Boston. So you'll see the data from this report, and it's not across the whole country. But again, this is just a microcosm of what happens to most urban public education systems when it comes to black girls. We get suspended not twice as much, not 3 times as much, but 6 times as much because of who we are, and probably because we're not feminine enough for people. We don't act right for people. Our mouths are loud. Our bodies are too animated. We do too much. So why are you in my classroom?
We have a question.
Yes.
Did they show an increase as they got older, or was this kind of across the board?
This is as far as the suspension rates
Yes, ma'am.
across the board. So we're talking about K through 12, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with, even as far as preschool, there is data and
Yes.
research out there.
Yeah,
We're talking about 3 and 4-year-olds,
right, yeah.
children of color, being suspended. And handcuffed. Right? So my point I'm trying to make is it's not just one isolated incident here or there. This is an epidemic across our country when it comes to black girls in urban public schools. So another thing I want to show you this recently happened that is just as disturbing as suspension. This happened as early as January. I want you to look at this slide. Anybody want to take a guess why they were strip searching 12-year-old girls?
Cell phone. Is it cell phone?
Nope.
Drugs.
Drugs. There was suspicion. And let me tell you what the suspicion was based upon the girls laughing too much. Because they were perceived as being too giddy, that was the word, too giddy, laughing too much, it was assumed they were under the influence of drugs. 12-year-olds. And so as you see, student D refused. And you see what happened to her. She got suspended. How black girls are being disproportionately marginalized and pushed out of our public education. So I want that to just resonate with you for a moment. So there is these perceptions. In another research article, Georgetown University had a report called Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. And in this report, it uses a term called adultification. So this term of adultification basically says that black girls are seen as older than what they really are. And so because they are seen as older, they are treated differently. So you imagine a 12-year-old perceived as maybe being a 15-year-old because she's laughing could get suspended and thought that she's under the influence of drugs. This adultification of black girls is a new term out in research. So when we adultify our black girls, we assume that they're more mature. We assume that they're more reliable. We assume that they're going to help in the classroom. And I've seen it. Teachers automatically assume and say, hey, I need you to pass out these papers. Hey, I need you to pick up these papers. You seem older and mature. No, I'm a kid, just like everybody else. But more than not, our black girls will be picked on and thought of as an adult when they're really not. They may look like it, but mentally they're not. So when we think through, when we treat our black girls like this as older and more mature, this interpretation causes us to see black girls as less feminine again, less docile, less innocent. They're not allowed to have their childhood in schools. So in this report, this adultification report, these perceptions in this research where they literally had adults, I think it was about 400 adults in this research, describe by looking at pictures what age they thought these girls were and who they thought these girls were, just by looking at them. And so out of this, black girls were perceived as needing less nurturing than white girls. Black girls were perceived as needing less protection than white girls. Black girls were perceived as needing less support than white girls. Black girls were perceived as needing less comfort than white girls. The loss of their innocence in a classroom. Yes, sir.
Were those 400 people, were they educators?
No. It was a random selection.
Because that possibly could have an effect, because if I teach students, you know, at the high school level, I probably would have a better idea of seeing kids on a daily basis of what grade they are versus somebody else that doesn't
Interact with students
kids
a lot. What are you going to say,
I
Carol?
was gonna say, it's starting at age 5, isn't it?
Yes.
Is that research?
Yes, so we're talking about, they were looking at girls between age 5 to 19, I think.
Yep.
Right? So we're talking about a little 5-year-old kid could be perceived as a 10-year-old kid. So just think about how that plays out again in a classroom. So we're talking about perception of black girls and the adultification of black girls. A lot of this ideas or stigmas around being feminine comes out of stereotypes, right? We all do it. We all stereotype. We all have them. We all are brainwashed with mainstream media to believe certain things about certain groups of people, okay? Black women and girls included. So there's this stereotype called ABW. Anybody know what ABW is? You do if you think about it real hard. We're talking about ABW and stereotypes. I give you the first word, angry. Oh, there it went. There it went, angry.
Black women.
The angry black woman. Anybody heard of that? The angry black woman. So imagine you're coming to a school or a system, a classroom, and all you know is these stereotypes. And one of those could be ABW. And so I wanted to present to you some visuals of ABW. Anybody recall any of these ABWs? Who are these ABWs?
Everyone.
Huh? Who are the ABWs?
Color purple.
Color purple. What's her name?
Miss Seeley.
Not Miss Seeley.
Miss Seeley.
That's Sophia. Who else do we see? Nene. Who else? Okay, who's it?
Foxy Brown.
Foxy Brown.
Foxy Brown.
Okay. So there's all these images of black women with a me mug. This is what we grow up with. This is the norm, right? This is your normal for most of us. And so when we take in this as all we know, this is what we believe black women are. And of course, a black woman begins as a black girl. Right? So we need to be mindful of our black girls and the stigmas we attach to them as an ABW. So the stereotypes of angry black women actually came out of Miss Ernestine Wade's character in the Amos and Andy show. Anybody remember that? Oh, black and white. Sapphire was her name. So sapphire is literally a term that black women are called when they're called an angry black woman. You are sapphire. Came out of this show. And so we also see these other stereotypes of black women. The mammy, the docile domestic worker, the Jezebel, the promiscuous woman, and then the welfare queen. These are all stereotypes in my research that keeps popping up time after time after time. As far as I could go back, when I was researching black women, these are the stereotypes that kept popping up. You can literally Google angry black women and this will come up. Okay? So this is not just something that Dr. Mathies is saying. This is real. This is how people will see us. So when we're looking at our interactions with our girls and the baggage we bring into our classroom, the stereotypes and those interactions will create microaggressions. Anybody ever heard of microaggression? Okay? So I'm going to have you all talk about some of the racialized microaggressions in your circle. Now, some of you won't say nothing. Some of you won't say a lot. But I want you to look through some of these racial microaggressions. Because these are interactions that our girls experience all the time. So think about a moment. Have you experienced microaggressions? If you haven't, why do you think you haven't? I'm not letting you off the hook. If you look and you don't think you've experienced these things, why do you feel like you probably haven't experienced a microaggression? So look at it, find one, think about it. What did it feel like? What happened? I'll give you about 5 minutes.
100%.
2, 1. No, it's good. It's good. My conversation's over. But we gotta move on. Run out of time. So microaggressions. I'm gonna invite someone to share something you heard. Anybody brave enough to share? A microaggression that someone shared with you?
We had the pleasure of having.
Tell me your name.
I'm Charita.
Charita, okay.
And we had Malaysia, right? We had the honor of hearing from Malaysia, and she says that she can be loud at times and kind of giggly. So she's heard the one about, well, she doesn't like when she hears, when I look at you, I do not see color, because she really doesn't understand that. But there was one about being loud. Thank you. Yes, why do you have to be so loud and animated? But what I loved hearing from her is that she feels like she's a junior, so she'll be graduating soon. But she really embraces herself now and feels confident. She talked about not using a chemical, which that one stands out for me. But it was just pretty amazing. We enjoyed listening to her. We can tell she's, off to doing great things in life.
That's my baby. Thank you, Charita. Give it up for Charita. You gotta be brave. Speak your truth. Okay, one more. Anybody brave enough? Something someone shared with you. Because you gotta be brave to share it. Anybody else? Okay. Come on, Tasia.
Since Malaysia didn't want to go. I already shared. So, in our group, we were talking about how, when I look at you, I don't see color, being kind of a accepted microaggression sometimes, because a lot of people don't see what's wrong with it. They think it's, kind of a nicer way of putting, like, you don't matter. And so we were talking about in the school system, when you're saying, like, there's only one race, the human race, it's pretty much telling all these young, like, African Americans that their color doesn't matter, which is who they are. So it's pretty much saying that, like, you as an individual don't matter. We're all just here.
Right. Give it up for Tasia. Out of the mouth of babes. Kids are talented. Color blindness. I would say, if I had to bet money on what happens the most in classrooms, it's probably color blindness. And I'm sure some educators in here would agree.
Oh, why are you so loud?
Yeah.
Yes.
He said especially in
Especially in middle school.
Yes.
I don't, you hear this conversation about when do black boys stop being adorable little kids and start being frightening? And you kind of see that same thing with black girls about when do they stop being adorable little pigtailed girls and start being loud and obnoxious and getting in the way of learning. And it's never said outright, but you can see it in people's faces when they're explaining how somebody acted in a class that day.
Tell me your name.
Josh.
Josh. Thank you, Josh. I got you. All right, so when we're talking about how do we combat, address, deal with microaggressions, we give our kids voice. You just saw an example of it. So there's something called the student voice pyramid, and in the student voice pyramid, it's basically talking about how we bring value to the classroom based upon where our kids come from. We allow space for them to be who they are. That's giving them voice. We let them be heard. We let them collaborate with us as adults. We give them leadership opportunities. So going back to how do we empower girls of color, especially our black girls, we have to give them space for voice. So that is what I will put in front of you. As an educator, do you allow your girls have voice? As a parent, do you allow your daughters to have voice? Community members. If not, then we need to figure out how to create those spaces. Because again, we are in a state of emergency with our black girls and how they're not feeling like they belong in our classrooms. So we got to create space for that belonging. When we're empowering our girls and we're fighting those stigmas and those stereotypes, Dr. Maya Angelou called it being phenomenal women. Beyonce called it making lemonade. But there was a woman named Kayshawn Thompson. And in 2013, Kayshawn Thompson noticed a lot of negative things being said about black women online. And so it bothered her so much to the point that Kayshawn Thompson felt like she had to do something about it. She needed to let her voice be heard about the value of black women. So, you may not know this, but Kayshawn Thompson created Black Girl Magic. So when we're talking about hashtag Black Girl Magic, anybody ever heard of that? See, it went viral. She did that in 2013. And it is one of the most popular hashtags, I could probably say, on the planet for the most part, because Kayshawn Thomas felt like black women weren't valued and she wanted to do something about it. So she's like, no, we are magical. So another way to empower our girls is how do we instill in them and bring out and nurture their magic? So when we're talking about black girls are magical, we're talking about giving them student voice. We're talking about battling stigmas and stereotypes in our classrooms. But we can't do this alone. So I want to give an example of how I don't do this alone. When I was working on my doctoral studies, I met some phenomenal women. And through my relationships with these phenomenal women, we bonded over being women of color, being mothers, being educators, and our passion for fighting injustice in our classrooms. And so we called ourselves Code Brave JCPS. What? And so when we're talking about not doing it on your own and finding people to push this message, finding people to support you and work with you, I was very intentional about making sure it wasn't just people that looked like me. So my whole point is when you're finding your allies to work with and support our girls, it can't always be the people that come from where you come from. Because correct me if I'm wrong, the civil rights movement was not done alone by just brown folks. Right? It took all kinds of folks. So when I bonded with these women, it wasn't just because I needed to find some brown folks to work and support brown folks. I needed to find some folks who was about this work in this life. And they just happen to be different from me. So I also want you to consider who's in your classrooms, in your schools, in your communities, where you work, whatever you're doing to support girls of color. Look for people who are not like you, because you're probably going to do more with people who are different from you. So I have the ladies here, and funny enough, one of them is a principal, and as a principal, I thought, wow, this would be really powerful if she could talk about how she supports girls of color in her school. Because as an instructional coach, I work with teachers. But as a principal, you're talking about fighting some different kind of demons. Demons.
All of them.
So I'm going to invite Dr. Marsha Carmichael Murphy to talk about just a little bit at her school, at an elementary school. Because I also want you to remember, this is not about a high school thing. This is not a middle school thing. Our babies are experiencing this. They're seeing differences. They're seeing race. They're talking about race. And so we can't ignore it. We can't silence them. So if Dr. Carmichael Murphy, you just give us a little bit about what's going on in your school.
All right, so I've been a principal for 2.5 seconds at Culver's Taylor Montessori, the premier Montessori choice in Jefferson County. And what I found when I first got there is that the data bears out, all the data points that Dr. Mathies pointed out are the case, except for students of color, boys and girls, are disciplined 9-1 at CTM. That was prior to my arrival. So what I had to do is I had to figure out how to create supports and structures in that building to address the microaggressions that were coming out in the discipline data. And that required some hard conversations that I got drugged for. I got drugged on Facebook. I got drugged to my face. I got drugged behind my back because I am having inappropriate conversations with teachers about race. Now, you and I know that they're not inappropriate conversations. It's the truth, okay? To the point where we have a student response team process. So every week, if you have had 5 or more SRT calls or 5 or more referrals, you have to have a sit down with the tribunal. Myself, the assistant principal, and the behavior coach. All 3 of us happen to be people of color, and I have 1 African-American teacher in my building, okay? And almost 70% of my students are African-American. So here I am bringing these people in. The first time we did it, 14 teachers had to come down, and I presented them with their data. And the very last piece was, you have some disproportionalities present in your data. You can't tell me that black boys and black girls are the only ones who are misbehaving in your classroom. So let's talk about it. This is the first time that these teachers had ever had conversations about who they're writing up and how they're engaging with them. From that first time where we had 14 teachers come in, we've had 3 teachers come back in that process. Now, I know some of them are probably saying, well, I'm just not gonna call SRT, I'm just gonna let things happen. But we send our district behavior coach and building behavior coach in to support. So that's one way, making sure that there are structures in place to address the inequities and then meeting those inequities head on. Dr. Polio talks about running towards the roar, and when it comes to race and equity, that's what I do. It is not easy, y'all, okay? Part of the reason why my voice is like this is because I'm in the trenches with the teachers and the students, and it's only Monday. Another thing, when I first got to CTM, there were only a couple of outlets for students of color, and they happened to be athletic. If you were a black boy, you played basketball. If you're a black girl, you were likely to be a cheerleader, okay? So one of the things I asked, I said, I have kids who are dancing. They're dancing in the line. Stay on the green line, guys. They're dancing. Okay? Why don't we have something that is an artistic outlet for them? So we started a step team. And they're going to be performing this weekend at the Derby Festival Step Show. So that's pretty awesome. And they're girls who have blossomed in a way that it's amazing to watch. Not because we made them be something they weren't, because that's not really what happened. They were able to be who they are in a very open way, and they have built a sisterhood amongst themselves, and they also have some mentors in the building. We have our nurse, Nurse Sham. She is awesome, and she's their go-to person. So that was another way. And then the final way, I think, is making sure that I am trying to seek opportunities for students. So we have connected with, obviously, Dr. Mathies and the Girls of Color. They're going to be coming over to do some work with our girls. And we also have two girl groups. One, a group of girls who are not rising to their potential. They're on the cusp. I call them cusp kids. They're right there, okay? And they need to be brought in. So my behavior coach, who is another person that went through the doctoral program with all of us, Dr. Angela Pleasant, she meets with them twice a week. And they talk about the ACT. They talk about what it takes to move on to the next level. Look, she's over here like, it's too much.
It's tomorrow. ACT's tomorrow. ACT's tomorrow.
Yeah, ACT's tomorrow.
Positive energy, positive.
So, yeah, so good vibes. But they talk about what it means to have a 22 on the ACT or higher. What is it going to mean for you as an African American female? What does it mean for you as a child from the 40203? What does it mean? And then I have another group of girls who is having some of this adultification that we talked about. They're not just adultified in the school, but even their parents and their family members are adultifying them. When they're in the neighborhood, they get adultified. And how do we combat that? Because they're 9, 10 years old. Okay? So how do we make them understand that they are kids and that they don't have to rise to these unrealistic expectations that people in society are placing on them? So those are just a few of the ways. But it's real, y'all. The work is real.
Dr. Marsha Carmichael.
No. I'm sorry. Yes, because I love her.
So my other partner, my color brave ally, Dr. Young, she is a behavior coach and a certified social worker. So I wanted Dr. Young to talk about how does she empower girls of color where she works at, or what do you do to work with girls of color?
So I want to start by sharing just briefly about my own racial identity and positionality, because I think that's important. As Dr. Mathies mentioned at the beginning, working with people that don't look like me and how important that is for doing the work that we do. And so we talked about in our circle colorblindness, and I was raised with a colorblind mentality, even though I'm half Chinese. My dad was Chinese, his side of the family's Chinese, but I was raised in primarily white middle-class communities, so I didn't really understand much about my own racial and ethnic identity until I lived in larger cities when I was in college and beyond. And since then, I've worked primarily in communities of color. And so that's just part of my journey and continuing to learn and understand both my own racial and ethnic identity and learning about other cultures and racial experiences that I just continue to learn and grow and ask questions. So I think that's one huge piece of it, is to come at the work from that perspective. And then in my actual position that I do, I work at the Academy Shawnee, and I think three kind of points of reference for empowering girls of color are one, looking at data. So as Dr. Carmichael mentioned, making sure that we continue to raise issues and questions of the data that we're seeing and the disproportionality around discipline and students of color, black girls and black boys. We are a majority minority school at Shawnee, but we still have a much higher percentage of black students being disciplined than white students, and so it's something that we talk about regularly at our leadership team meetings and with our behavior support team, trying to figure out ways to both
kind of systemically address those issues and with those individual students and the situations that are occurring. And then from the teacher perspective, so you can see this is a picture of a embedded professional development we have weekly embedded professional development, and we are a restorative practices school. So for those of you that are familiar, one of the key components is this idea of the with box in the top right hand corner, the gray one. So that aligns really well with the student voice pyramid that Dr. Mathies showed about collaboration and bringing people together, both students and teachers. So one of the things we do is really try to create spaces for students to be heard and for them to really communicate with their teachers, for teachers to be vulnerable with students, so they are seen more as, you know, a person beyond just the teacher and the person of authority in the school. And so trying to bridge relationships that way and help teachers and students understand the importance of reciprocal relationships. I bring something to the table, and so do you, and we need to have that understanding and expectation of each other. And then another piece of that is the work that I do directly with students. So working with student leadership teams. So I support the Girls of Color work that Dr. Mathies leads, and I think one of the things that was interesting to us recently, we went to a middle school and took some students, and there was a woman who had invited us there to have a conversation with the Girls of Color in that school, and it was incredibly powerful to just create a space for them to talk about their experiences, and our students led it, so props to them. But the woman contacted Dr. Mathies after and was talking about, well, should I really be the one to lead this work as a white woman? And so we could use our work together as an example of, you know, as long as you are genuine and reflective and are there with them, with the girls, supporting them, and they see you in that role, absolutely. You don't have to be, you know, look the same to be able to support our students and create those spaces. So I think that was an important understanding for her to have, an example to have. And then finally, with supporting our students and really highlighting strengths, that's one of the things that I come to the table with from both my social work perspective and the work I've done around race and education. And so working with students around leadership, I have 2 student leadership teams of about 10 students in the 9th grade and about 10 students in 10th and 11th grade, working with them. And they're students that were identified by having sort of problem behaviors. And so I work with them on a weekly basis to help them understand their strengths and how they can use their influence to positively serve as role models for their peers rather than disrupting the community, which is often how it plays out, and then helping them to communicate their strengths to their teachers and advocate for themselves, and at the same time helping their teachers to embrace and understand what they're seeing as a potential strength and not a problem. So for example, the loudness, and Atasia was giving some great examples of this in her experience, can be, you know, reframed as passion and commitment and confidence rather than a negative.
Dr. Young. They good. That's why we are allies, about that work. So my role, I work, as I said, really closely with teachers. So I want to bring really quickly a little bit of what I do when I work with teachers. And so there's this term called culturally responsive teaching. Anybody heard of that? Yes, culturally responsive teaching. So if you're not aware of the racial equity policy, every school now is required to have a racial equity plan. And part of the racial equity plan, there is this surge of people wanting culturally responsive teaching. And so our teachers, also included, we talk about how do we create inclusive classrooms for our kids, particularly our students of color. And so I lean into Gloria Ladson-Billings and her book, The Dream Keepers. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. It is a good resource to examine how to be successful with African American children. And so when I'm working with teachers, I always recommend the Dream Keepers on how do we create inclusive classrooms that are culturally responsive. And as Dr. Young mentioned earlier, we want to be culturally responsive by bringing out strengths. What you see as a deficit is not necessarily a deficit. You call me loud, I call me passionate. You call me loud, I call myself confident. Those are strengths in my community that are valued, to be loud and passionate and stick up for myself. Because that's what I've had to do all my life where I come from. And I'm going to bring that to the classroom. So as educators, we also have to shift our thinking about what is a deficit versus a strength. So again, when we're talking about being culturally responsive in the classroom, a major topic or theme that I talk about is how are you bringing in strengths-based thinking with our girls? Are you automatically labeling them with a negative label based upon your upbringing? Keep that in mind. The deficit model only sees things that needs to be fixed, but a strengths-based model will see the black girl magic in our girls. The strengths-based thinking will pull out the black girl magic and use that and harness that to help them be successful in classrooms. There's another book I want to bring to your attention when I'm working with teachers to bring out strengths-based thinking. It's called Culture Responsive Teaching and the Brain. Another amazing resource when you're trying to create inclusive classrooms for culturally diverse students. And so in Culture Responsive Teaching the Brain, Zaretta Hammond talks about how it's not about I need to reach 1,001 cultures, each individually in their own different way. I'm not going to sing, song, and rap the ABCs for my black kids all the time. That is not necessarily the only way to be culture responsive. Zaretta Hammond talks about breaking down cultures into two categories to reach kids of color. And those two categories are called collectivist and individualistic. And she looks at the world and breaks it into these two categories of how to reach our kids of color. So when you look at societies, countries across the planet, is America individualistic or collectivist? What is it? What made you say individualistic?
Well, the terms of I or individual or not working as a collective, self-responsibility, so yeah, all that. Yeah.
Conversation about success is about getting the better job, being able to be the individual who does better, self-actualization being that perfect you.
So, let's put this in context. So, in America, we are an individualistic society. But, when we look across the rest of the world, look at that. Indigenous people of color come from collectivist societies. We move as a group. Basic, bottom line. So when we move as a group, we bring those cultural values to our classrooms. So imagine a little girl who may be one of two little brown girls and told you can't work with the other brown girl. These things have repercussions in our classroom based upon where we come from. I know myself growing up. You go to the store together. You go to the bathroom together. Okay? You move in groups. You work in groups. You braid my hair, I braid your hair. We move in groups. So if you don't realize how that impacts their understanding in a classroom when they're not allowed to move with a group, they're not allowed to interact with a group, they're not allowed to learn in a group, they're not going to be successful because it goes against their cultural values. We are collectivists in communities of color. So keep that in mind, educators, as you create these spaces for our girls of color. Zaretta Hammond in Culture Responsive Teaching and the Brain, when she breaks down individualist and collectivist, she also brings in surface versus deep culture. So, if I'm going to create a classroom with surface culture understanding, this is where I usually see most of teachers hang out. They hang out in the surface culture. So the surface culture is, it's Black History Month. I'm going to do my Black History Bulletin. There's your culture. Surface culture is, we're going to do food and festivals. All the international students, bring your dish. Surface culture. And not to say that that's wrong, because I'd rather you do surface than nothing. But I challenge you as an educator, or even as a parent or community member, ask your teachers, your principal, how are you celebrating, acknowledging multiple cultures on a deep level outside of this bulletin board? Deeper culture. So I challenge teachers, again, my role is to work and support teachers in their classrooms, is to push a little deeper into collectivist culture. And what does that look like? Deeper culture is those deep messages we get from our collectivist values. Deeper culture is, again, are we giving opportunities to work in a group? Are we giving students an opportunity to co-create the learning environment? As Dr. Young said, teachers just don't talk to each other when we get professional development. We bring students into the circle. And we get students to tell us, what do you need from us? We co-create the learning space with our students. That's deeper. So I also want you to think about, and take this back to your buildings, to challenge your colleagues. Are we going deep enough with our kids in our classrooms when we're bringing their cultures into the classroom? So Dr. James Banks gives a great visual. And I just want to bring to your attention, to move up from surface to deeper would mean to go into social action. So when we move into social action with our kids, we are empowering them, giving them voice to create social change in their community. That means you're going deep with your learning. I'm not just going to give you information and knowledge. We're going to create knowledge together, and then we're going to take that knowledge, and then we're going to do something positive with it in the community. That's deeper learning. That's deeper understanding. So this is one frame to think about, how do we push our learning into deeper learning with our students of color so they feel like they belong in our classrooms? So as I wrap up, we got another surprise, because I want to give you some real voices and some real examples of how do you go deep with kids. So as Dr. Young said, I work with a group of girls called the Shawnee Girls of Color. And this African proverb just kind of like hit me on the top of my head. Is this not true? Won't they burn it down? Yes, whether you like it or not. So if we know kids, students, young adults, our youth will be heard, create the space. Create the space. And so that's what I try to do with my girls of color at Shawnee. I try to give them space to be themselves. So, quick examples, as Dr. Young said, the middle school we went to, that is a picture of them talking to the middle school girls. And in this moment, we had 8th graders crying. They were literally in circles like this, just like we're talking, and they were so upset about their experience of being a black girl. It brought tears to their eyes. And just the opportunity to share with other black girls how they felt made them cry. That was the power in that moment. And these middle school girls listening to my high school girls, and vice versa. And there was a moment where the girls didn't feel like they belonged because of their hair. They didn't feel like they belonged because of their body. They didn't feel like they belonged because they were picked on. And my girls came in and said, this is going to pass. Middle school does not last forever. Middle school will not last forever. But it was a moment. And then here's another moment with some of the girls where we've been to conferences and we've had girls talk to adults and educators just like you all. Leadership opportunities. Somewhere else, these girls may be perceived as loud, belligerent, attitude, extra,
It's me.
drama, and that's Malaysia all day.
It's me.
All day.
So?
But when we put them in front and give them opportunity and the space to lead, watch what happens, y'all. It's amazing.